Okay. You want to go ahead and go to the next slide? There you go. So just a quick background. We are literacy in the disciplines, grade 6 through 12. Our purpose is the fact that when a group of us from higher ed, we kind of got together and we were working with another group prior to being literacy in the disciplines. And a lot of the discussion was revolving around what teachers need to know. It was very assumption based. And as various people in higher ed, we're all teacher educators. We work with teachers. We were teachers. We still are teachers for a lot of us in PK through 12 classrooms. We realized that we needed to do a little bit better. We needed to do it differently. We needed to gather actual teacher voice, teacher perspective. And so we started to form and create a statewide survey to gather student teacher voice and find out, well, what are the needs of teachers rather than us making assumptions as to what they are. And then based on those needs, we're hoping to offer professional learning opportunities in schools, as well as webinars and things like this. But all of it comes down to this idea of we're really focused on content area and disciplinary literacy across middle school and high school, which is a little niche from some of the other organizations that exist. But we are here to support teachers across the state. Go ahead and to the next slide, please. And so with this presentation, this is our first of hopefully many, many to come, one every month, but we really wanted to focus on something that many of us are passionate about. And so we asked Dr. Jennifer Morrison from the University of South Carolina to just spearhead the start of our monthly webinars. Dr. Morrison is a clinical assistant professor at the University of South Carolina and a national board certified teacher. She earned her PhD from the University of Nevada, Reno in language literacy and culture. She worked as a middle and high school English teacher and instructional coach for 19 years. Her research agenda focuses on teacher induction, literacy attainment, particularly digital and multimodal, and teacher inquiry processes. She has been published in many different journals to include English Journal, JAL, Talking Points, Principal Leadership, and Educational Leadership. For our organization, she serves as our wonderful secretary. And I am Dr. Rochelle Savitz from Clemson University. I am an assistant professor of adolescent literacy and president for literacy in the discipline 612. Jennifer, it's all yours.
Yay. All right. Thank you, Rochelle. I appreciate your covering all of that background information. And, you know, I have this work in order to be able to go through and talk about, but please feel free to drop questions into the chat. And if there's things where you're like, hey, I'd like to know this, you know, please make sure that you're doing that. Rochelle's going to be keeping an eye on the chat so that, and if there's anything where I need to address it, she can go, yo, stop, wait a minute. Oh, hey, and let me know what I might need to do. Okay. So my presentation here, the webinar here is focused on a picture book's worth 1,000 words. And the focus is on using diverse picture books to craft critical middle and secondary classrooms. And that was the big focus, is that I wanted to kind of steer it towards middle and secondary classrooms, because too often we think of picture books as being for children, little children, and yet they're not. They are widespread in terms of their appeal and their use. What I'm going to be presenting to you today is based on chapters, articles, and presentations that I've done with two of my colleagues, one of whom is Dr. Melissa Wells, who's at the University of Mary Washington, and Dr. Julia Lopez Robertson, who is my colleague at the University of South Carolina. And I want to make sure that I give plenty of credit, because this is something that we have done all collaboratively. I happen to be the one that's presenting it today, but this is work that the three of us have put together. And I want to make sure that I'm really emphasizing that. What we're going to be doing today is covering a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to do is explain critical reading and critical literacy and how we define those, because oftentimes they are conflated as being the same thing, and they're not. And then talking about how those relate to picture books and the picture books being able to develop those skills. And then I'm going to talk about 3 approaches that will help us to be able to use those picture books in critical ways with middle and high school students. So for this session, one of the things that might be nice for you to have, and again, you don't have to have it, but it's a nice to have, is there's going to be a picture book analysis matrix that I will be talking about later on in the presentation, that if you would like to pull that up, you certainly can. Rochelle, maybe you can drop that link within the chat. That would be awesome. And then, like I said, please feel free to drop questions and comments in the chat at any time.
Okay. Hey, Jennifer, I just want to we don't have access to open it. I'm going to drop the link, but just letting you know that.
Okay. You don't. I thought I set that up so that with the link that it would be okay. Do you want me to take care of that right now or not worry about it?
I think everybody would, none of you would mind if she does that real quick, would ya? That way you'll have access.
Okay, let me try and take a look at that real quick.
I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
We have a small group, so I'm like, yeah, we're good.
It's okay. Let me just check it. So share. Oh, I know I changed this, but obviously it didn't take. Anyone with the link can view. That should be the way that it is. Anyone on the internet with this link can view. Done. Try it now.
Go ahead and yes.
You got it now? Cool.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Sometimes it just doesn't take. That's all. It just has to be cranky. All right. So you don't have to have it, but again, it's nice to have for you to be able to pull up. It's going to be something that you can try out when we get to that point. I really liked this quote from Maurice Sendak because, again, it's that whole idea of really underestimating what picture books are. Too many people do that. The picture book is a peculiar art form that thrives on genius, intuition, daring, and meticulous attention to its history and various complex components. The picture book is a picture puzzle, badly misunderstood by critics and condescended to by far too many as merely a trifle for kiddies. And I start because that's kind of the philosophy going into this, is that these are not something that we just, do as a read aloud in a kindergarten classroom and call it a day in order to entertain our kids. That we really need to look at picture books as being something that are very valuable in terms of instruction and content and skill knowledge. This is something that I just want you to go ahead and drop into the chat. And that is, what picture books do you currently have on your classroom library shelves within your own library? And then what picture books do you explicitly teach within your curriculum, whether that's in higher ed, whether that's within a classroom? What is it that you actually use? And if you can just take a couple of minutes in order to drop those into the chat, I'm curious to see what everybody uses. And I'll take a second in order to let you guys do that. All right, I'm just some things that are popping up: math curse and circumference. Love that, because here we go. I pulled my math curse book, and I know it's backwards because it's mirrored, but I pulled out my math curse book because I love this book. This is such a great book for both teaching math concepts and just being able to think through things. So I love the fact that you've got that. Your Life Matters, awesome. Some great picture books that engage students in coat of many colors. Okay, awesome. Love that. I also have a couple, we're going to talk about a few more, but I know I referenced The Other Side. I have as a picture on that front page. And then there's a couple of new ones that I've just picked up that are really fantastic. Soulway by Lupita and Wong, Nonga. I know I said her name completely wrong, but this is a beautiful book. I mean, it's illustrated by Vashti Harrison, so enough said. It's just a gorgeous book. And then science-wise, The Stuff of Stars. So this is about astronomy. Love it. And then I've got a couple that I'm going to be talking about later on. All right. Thank you, Mr. Falker. Love that. Good. That's a great book too. Thank you so much for sharing those. That helps me to kind of get a sense of the things that you're already doing. So that's awesome. So let's go ahead and start off with defining critical reading and critical literacy, and just make sure that we understand what this terminology is, because too often these terms are conflated and mixed up. And so I want to make sure that we are very clear on what the distinctions between each are, because each one have different purposes. Critical reading is really focused on deliberately uncovering a relationship between a reader, writer, and a subject. I used to teach it as the rhetorical triangle, Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, where you looked at the relationship between the reader, the writer, and the subject, and what was that relationship? What was the reader thinking about the writer what was the writer thinking about the reader when they wrote it? What did they think that the reader would know about the subject? What did they know about the subject, et cetera, et cetera. The analysis of a writer's craft is done in order to unearth that authorial intention. What is the author's intention? How did they convey that? What are the rhetorical devices that they're using in order to be able to convey that effect or that particular intention? What are they trying to do? How are they using ethos, logos, pathos in order to affect the reader's thoughts, emotions, thinking, logic? It's active meaning making, and the readers reflect on that reading and thinking process. But it really, the big thing with critical reading is it's about unearthing that authorial intention. Okay, what did the author intend? Critical literacy, on the other hand, really is about the relationship of the learner with the world. And it's about active meaning making. In this case, the reader is more about what are they bringing into the piece. What are the things that they know and how are they making meaning of it based on their own experiences? There are 4 dimensions according to Lewis and Flint and Van Sluis, which is disrupting the commonplace, interrogating multiple viewpoints, focusing on socio-political issues, and taking ongoing action to promote social justice. And that when we think about critical literacy, we're thinking about power and issues of power. Critical always tends to deal with power. In this regard. So we're looking at that active meaning making again, just like critical reading is, but in this case, we're thinking about this in terms of what do I bring into this? How do I respond to this? Yes, I'm still maybe looking at authorial intention, but I have to critically read before I then can start applying my critical literacy. So these 2 things are not dichotomous and opposite, but they interweave and we can teach them together. But we have to understand that they have 2 different purposes. Okay. And that's something that we're going to keep in mind as we go through and take a look at each one of these different approaches. Critical reading in picture books, the reason why we want to engage in it in picture books is that because it does in fact allow for discussions of authors and artists' intention and craft and how those things fit together. How is it the author's intentions and the artist's intentions come together in order to create a certain approach, argument, assertion. And then it also allows students to be able to use both images and words to substantiate their claims and their interpretations of whatever might be happening. So if they're going to say, here's what the author's intent was, here's why they did it, here's how they did it, they are then able to pull in images and words in order to be able to substantiate that. The interaction between printed text and visual images is just really incredibly important. For books with younger readers, we know that tends to develop many of the literacy elements like plot, character, etc. For older readers, our adolescents, critical reading in picture books allows them to be able to look at character relationships, settings, moods, and how authors use the images, how authors use their words in order to be able to create that particular position. With critical literacy in picture books, oftentimes, again, we're getting that multimodal input, which means that there's multiple opportunities to construct different kinds of meanings. And if those picture books are multicultural, many times they can challenge the status quo by bringing in additional voices from the literary canon. So we have our literary canon, but then we also have all of these other voices that help to shape it, flesh it out, provide opposition. It reflects the diversity of our world and it reflects readers' identity. And it is we can intentionally scaffold our discussions so that we can think about not only what is the content of this book, but how does that fit in with a meaningful, relevant, and an important part of our society? How do we function within a diverse society? And those are the kinds of questions that we can ask that extend us from critical reading into the critical literacy of those picture books. Why use picture books with adolescents? Couple of reasons. First of all, it does create a safe space for us to introduce material that can be conceptually, emotionally, or politically difficult. Sometimes it's easier for us to present something within a picture book which seems more innocuous than in something that's an essay or a documentary or something along those lines. And so oftentimes we can deal with something that might have triggers or that might be a difficult conversation, and we can introduce it through a picture book. It strengthens classroom community because it is often a quicker read, even though looking at the pictures, you really do have to go through it multiple times. They still set themselves up for multiple reads. Because the fact that we can do it in a quicker manner, oftentimes that helps us to strengthen the community. We're able to actually explore those themes together. And it does encourage multiple readings. And I'm going to show you an example of something where I didn't catch something that's in the picture that I'm going to show you the first several times that I looked at this. And then all of a sudden I went, oh, look at that. There it is. It provides content access points for our striving readers, including students who have neurological or language differences. I had 8th graders that were reading on 1st and 2nd grade level. And the problem with that always is, how do you find something that's appropriate in terms of maturity, but then that they still can read? And that's always been one of the problems with our students who are in those kinds of circumstances. And picture books allow us to have them build that vocabulary, the disciplinary language and concepts in ways that are a lot safer and don't feel condescending, like sometimes the books can for students who are in that situation. Okay. So I'm going to now talk about 3 approaches to critical analysis. These are ways that we might be able to use books, and I'm going to talk about some very concrete books and show you how these approaches might be able to be used with books within a classroom. Okay. The first one, and one of the things we did was we did include like these little keys, so you're going to know which ones they go with. The first approach is to critically analyze broad representation. The second is to really focus on critical visual analysis. And the third is to analyze voices and perspectives that are in those picture books. How are we doing so far? Rochelle, we have any questions or anything that I need to address at this point?
We're doing really well. We still have some sharing of some books and exciting things happening in chat.
Awesome. Love that. All right. So let's start off with critically analyzing our broad representation. One of the first things that I skipped through some things about building libraries. There are some things at the end that I put into the slide share that if you do decide that you want to have that, it's available to you, but I'm not going through it right here. So the first thing is that we really want to look at and make sure that we do not have superficial inventories. Representation is not always good enough. Okay, we have to look at what that representation actually is, and we have to consider what contextual factors are going on. So for example, if we look at books that portray people of color, we have to think about what is the setting, the theme, and the plot of the book. What linguistic and artistic choices are being made? And we have to make sure that our critical reading and critical literacy ensure that we have this meaningful broad representation of multiple perspectives, because it's very easy for us to say, oh, well, this is a book with a person of color. I've got my representation. We have to look and see how that representation is actually occurring. And I'm going to talk through that in the next couple of slides and some examples of that. So if we think about broad representation and looking at broad representation from a critical reading perspective, we have to consider the linguistic choices and the intended effect on those choices on the reader. Okay, so remember, it's about authorial intent and how are they doing it? What's that author's what are they doing in terms of their craft in order to make that happen? So we might ask students to consider why an author has chosen to use words like bodega or mercado instead of a grocery store or market. Why are they using those words within the text? And then what is the impact on the reader for including those words? Why choose these words instead of those? And what's the impact on us as readers? And we want to look at our terms in languages other than English defined in English. Or does the author expect that the reader to actively construct meaning from context clues? Because those are two different things. I mean, if we have something like Skippy John Jones, very enjoyable book, but if we take a look at it, is the Spanish being used in an authentic and relevant way? Or is it being used in a way that may not be appropriate for that particular culture? And we want to look at those things and consider it. Again, just because it's in there doesn't mean that it's an appropriate representation. Critical literacy, we might look at that and consider, how are we disrupting the commonplace with themes like this? So for example, oftentimes if we see, and we see this across all kinds of books, if African-American or Indigenous characters are there, almost always they are overcoming adversity or fighting for justice. We see that over and over and over and over again. Okay, that we want to look and see, are our characters doing something besides always trying to overcome and fighting adversity and fighting justice? I had somebody one time say, you know, I really like a book where Black kids just collecting baseball cards. you know, that it becomes normalized. And we want to look at things like, a lot of times books about the civil rights movement, once I became aware of this, I started going, oh my gosh, it's absolutely true. Everything that's focused on the civil rights movement, those pictures are in black and white. The thing is that those events took place, there were definitely color cameras, okay, different color photographs. And yet most of the time they're presented in black and white to make it seem like it was a long time ago, to make it seem like this wasn't something that happened just, you know, in the 60s, 70s, that this is something that was so much longer ago. And it's really interesting to think about what's the impact of that and why are they doing it? What's the agenda of the people? And that's critical literacy gets to agendas. You know, critical reading is about, you know, the intention. Critical literacy is about an agenda and a social political agenda. We might also think about, do most of the picture books with Indigenous characters focus on early American history? You know, first Thanksgivings, okay? Are we looking at the fact that everything seems to be historical and that Indigenous people do not still exist, okay? Do picture books with Indigenous characters occur in those common day contexts? Are they still here? And how do they function within the current here and now? Because very often those books are about the past and about history, and we don't have that representation of, hey, they're here now, and here's what they're doing, okay? So what can we do in order to try and start looking at this broader representation of people? And in order to counteract those sociopolitical trends, we want to make sure that we are not overlooking the lived experience of marginalized groups, and that we have these restrictive identities, okay, like Indigenous characters being referred to in the past. So we want to make sure that we're looking at books that portray people of color in the current day, dealing with relevant, normalized issues. We want to engage students in analyzing those broad representations of their own experiences. You know, how does this relate to your own experiences? How does this relate to the things that you have lived? Ask students, and that's another thing we don't ask students enough. You know, if we're making these decisions, ask students if they see themselves in these picture books. You know, just because it's a book with a student of color doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be something that the child's going to relate to. And we want to make sure that we're asking them, does this match your identity? Can we do a better job of making sure that reflecting that in the picture books that we're choosing? And we want to make sure that they do see themselves in the text in lots of different ways, whether that's cultural, racial, ethnic, linguistically. We want to make sure that we position them as experts within those particular identities. So an example that we can look at is We Are Water Protectors. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. Beautiful book, absolutely gorgeous. I think it came out last year to 2 years ago. It's a very recent book that came out. You'll notice that it was both written and illustrated by women. And it's the first time that the Caldecott Medal was given to a book that was written and illustrated by women. So, which is pretty darn exciting. Okay, so you can see we have these images, and it is about I'm going to mutilate this word, I'm sorry, Ojibwe, a girl who fights against the Dakota Access Pipeline. It was in fact inspired by Indigenous-led movements across North America, and it was a rallying cry about the harm that is being done to Earth's water. What you'll see on the left-hand side is you're going to see a picture of the actual event that was happening, and it was in 2016. So this is very recent. And you're going to see that this was the view from her people's perspective as they were behind her, as she was holding up the feather. And if we go back to this picture, we're going to see this was what the police were seeing, where we have that perspective of her holding up the feather with all of her people behind her in order to support this action against the poisoning and the harm of the water. Okay. And that's something for us to really consider and to think about is that we're showing, yes, that there's activism going on, but it's activism for climate and for the earth, and not necessarily for their own civil rights. We also see there's this perspective, these multiple perspectives in the way that things are illustrated. And we also see that this is Indigenous people present today, taking action today. And so we want to look at and consider how is this representing that broader representation of people, okay? So that is the first approach that we wanted to share with you. The second approach is critical visual analysis. Okay. So far, so good, Rochelle?
Doing well here.
All right, make sure. I just want to pause, make sure that everybody's kind of processing here for a little bit. So with critical visual analysis, I like to discuss this in terms of books that are only images, only pictures. So that when there are only images, they have to become the narrative. They have to carry the story. And that means that we have to not only understand the sequencing and the visual representation of these elements, we can't rely on the words. We have to really focus on being able to make meaning of artistic choices and using things like literary elements and the design elements that we may not necessarily always be comfortable with discussing, okay? Those are mixed in with those, the elements of design and the principles of design that are mixed in with those literary elements. We're very comfortable with literary elements and talking about metaphor, irony, all of that stuff, okay? But we have to think about those now, not in terms of words, but we also have to think about those in terms of pictures. And then that brings in a whole new language for us, which is the whole idea of using design elements like color, angle, texture, light, movement, shape, and space. It means that we have to look at the principles of design: balance, contrast, emphasis, movement, pattern, proportion, alignment, and unity. Because now the language that we have may involve literary elements, but it will definitely involve artistic elements, and we have to bring those things together. So how do we look at this in terms of critical reading and critical literacy? You still can read pictures, you're still reading images. We have to analyze those illustrations using the language that's associated with narrative traditional elements as well as artistic design. So what is the artist's intention? We have to consider sequencing, perspective, point of view, and space. Point of view becomes really important. Is this subjective? Is it objective? And what does that do for us as readers, for us to be able to understand that story? And where are we being positioned as the readers within this? We also want to consider how the artists use their craft in order to create emotional or logical messages, and what's that intention. So some of the language that we might talk about, I mentioned subjective and objective shots. A subjective shot is from a particular person's perspective, okay? An objective shot is just a plain neutral picture. I'll show you some examples of both of those. We might also talk about parallel images, and we'll talk about rule of thirds. We'll also talk about visual images. I'm going to show you some examples of all of those. And all of those are really important for us to be able to unpack and make meaning of the text. Now, critical literacy is where we invite the students again to bring their identities and backgrounds into the reading, and in this case, into the images. We want students to be able to engage in those conversations about the social and political ideas that are emerging from the pictures. So what is coming out of this that is focused on, our social and political situatedness? We want to invite students to take up those multiple viewpoints. And this literally can be done. The thing with pictures is we can literally take multiple viewpoints by looking at and how things are illustrated and how we are positioning ourselves within those images. And that helps us to question the status quo that's presented. We also want to consider what actions might need to be taken, because the thing with critical literacy, if you remember those 4 components, it isn't just about understanding and questioning the status quo, it's also about taking action. And so we want to think about, well, what kinds of actions can we take with this? So some examples of critical literacy that might come out of some of the books that we're going to take a look at, or some of the images that we're going to take a look at, is issues of a white protagonist in a story about enslavement. That comes down to who gets to tell whose stories. And talking about lived experience of immigrants. Again, we're going to take a look at that. So let's take a look at this example. This is an image from the book Unspoken, which is the story of an underground railroad. Okay, and right here, I got it. Here it is. It's an awesome book. Okay. Now, if we take a look at this picture, what we have is this is an objective shot. Okay, we are a neutral party that is looking at an event that is happening within a hen house. We have a girl who is looking over her shoulder, and she's looking in such a way that we can tell there's been a movement that's caught her attention. Okay, and we have these corn stalks that take up a huge portion of the side of the book. Okay, so an entire portion of this, which means that there's something to it. There's a focus, and she's looking right at the corn stalks, which means that there's some sort of movement or something that we should be showing our attention to this. The use of space and the use of the way that she is, that objective shot where we can see that she's looking back, helps us to be able to make a meaning of, okay, something's happened in the corn stalk, caught her attention. It's obviously very important, takes up a big amount of space. This is the thing that I didn't realize until I'd looked at this book probably 10 times. If you look in this upper right corner, you're going to see there's an eye right here. Does everybody see it? It is so subtle. Like I said, I did not notice it right away. Now, it becomes very important when we turn the page and we now have, this is a subjective shot. This is from the girl's point of view as she has come over and taken a look at the corn. We can see that the corn stalks now take up the entire space, okay? And what we also notice is that I is now at a point called the rule of, it's at a point where you've got an intersection in the thirds. Rule of thirds is where you have, and I've got that superimposed here, is that basically in art, things are, we tend to gravitate towards things that are broken into thirds, and we like things to be in one of those spaces, whether that's vertically or horizontally. And when we have something that's at that intersection of a horizontal and a vertical rule of thirds, it's very energizing. And it usually is, it calls a lot of attention to that particular item, whatever that might happen to be. And that would be something where we can talk about, well, what did the artist do? Why did the artist position the eye right there at that intersection? And how does that make us respond? We're like, oh my gosh, it's there, okay? But it's also energizing, it's important. We know that there's some importance to this. Okay, and we also are seeing this again through the girl's eye. So now we're aligning ourselves with her. Later in the book, we come to, this is a neutral objective shot. However, this is now the girl hiding because the slave, the people who are seeking slaves have come into her house. They're trying to find the person who had escaped. And she is now taken up hiding. What you'll notice is between these two pictures, we have this kind of flipped mirror image. We've got the enslaved individual over here on the right, or yeah, on the right-hand side. And then we have the girl who's now hiding behind this knothole on the left-hand side. So while their experiences are not the same, they're parallel, they're mirroring each other, okay? We also see that it's not exactly on the rule of thirds, okay? It's not in that intersection, which again indicates that we're not exactly the same experience, but we've got this really incredible mirroring of their experiences of having to hide out of fear. And this is done purposely. This is one of those things where we look at this, we analyze it, we say, okay, why is the artist doing this? Why are they setting it up this way? And that becomes really important as we then can start taking those conversations from analyzing the artistic part of this into the, okay, the white young lady is in fact our protagonist. Is it okay that she's the protagonist of the story? And by the way, do we ever see the person who is enslaved? No, we don't. We only ever see the eye. Why is that? What does that mean? What does that indicate? And those become the questions that we can start asking students about these images. In another book, The Arrival by Sean Tan, we see again the use of perspective and space. And in this case, we've got these visual metaphors. If we look way down here, this is our family, our protagonist family way down here, okay? And they are dwarfed, they are in the darkness. You've got these tendrils of something that is just dominating and taking over, and they're threatening. It's a very threatening image. And they are so tiny and so small down here. And what we then see is the use of space by this artist to be able to demonstrate whether it's a political, a social, some sort of oppressive force that is overtaking these individuals. And we see that once they have gone, because what's happening is that the father figure is leaving, and they take him down to a boat where he gets on and he's heading off, and it's an immigrant experience. We then will follow him in a minute. The mother and the child are heading back in. And again, we see these tendrils. We see that the buildings are closing in on them. It's a very threatening image that they're heading back into this very scary environment. What could that be? What might be represented by those tentacles and those tendrils? We follow the father figure into another situation where he is trying to work with the immigration officer. And we can see that he's trying to listen. He doesn't understand. He's trying to communicate. He's saying things. He's holding up pictures of his family. And he's just exhausted. And we are able to get through this sequencing how very frustrated he is through this process of trying to communicate with the immigration officer, and what it must be like as to be an immigrant where you can't speak the language, you don't understand, you don't have a way of communicating anything to this individual. What do? I try to hold up pictures, I try to illustrate. How do I get through this? And the sense of hopelessness that can come with that immigrant experience, and all of that is detailed without any words. And that's one of the things that makes this really powerful, is now we're getting to the interpretation of images that students who are striving readers, students who are high level readers are going to be able to do this. All of them are going to be able to do this. It kind of is an equalizer for their being able to discuss it. All right, the last approach that I want to address with you is analyzing voices and perspectives in picture books. And this is a tool that Melissa Wells developed, and I want to make sure that I'm very clear that she developed this, and I'm just sharing what she has done. It's the grid. So if you've got that grid and you want to pull it up, she created this kind of template or grid for you to be able to use to think about whose voices are heard, whose voices are not heard, and how is story being shaped by those voices. She actually breaks it out into a couple of different categories that you can then look at with students. You can do this as for yourself, looking at your own books. If you are a teacher educator, this is something that you can teach your teachers in order to be able to help them to evaluate their libraries. Race, gender, sexuality, family composition, SES, and little stars for whatever else you might want to fill in. We're going to talk about religion for this particular example. But what this does is, as I said, it can be used in a number of different ways for a number of multiple contexts. And basically, it's to help you to be able to look at what picture books do I have, what picture books can I balance this with, and how can I make sure that I'm getting those multiple voices represented, okay? In terms of critical reading, it helps us to be able to read those words and images closely and be able to make some decisions about what's being done and why it's being done. We are able to also document patterns in those relevant columns. We're able to see what are the patterns that are emerging across those books. In critical literacy, we're able to look at, again, how are these authors and illustrators disrupting the commonplace, interrogating multiple viewpoints, centering on sociopolitical issues, and contributing to the ongoing action. Those four components that Lewis and et al. Pointed out. So we're going to just kind of walk through this with the last stop on Market Street. And I'm going to just show you a couple of pages, and we're going to talk through how we might fill this out. So if you're not familiar with Last Stop on Market Street, it is by Magda Pena, and we've got Christian Robinson who's doing the illustrations on it. So we might start off with looking at the writing here, which says CJ pushed through the church doors and skipped down the steps. So we're able to identify that's probably CJ right there. One of the things that we're going to notice about CJ is that he has darker colored skin. Okay, so that's going to be something where we're going to look at that and go, that means that he's probably a person of color. So we might come over here and we might be able to make some guesses with regard to what his race might be, and we would fill that in. The outside air smelled like freedom, but it also smelled like rain, which freckled CJ's shirt and dripped down his nose. We also see the fact that we have church doors, is what is mentioned. We can see that we have got stained glass here. But one of the things that's missing that's normally in a Christian church is that we normally have some sort of a cross, or we have some sort of a steeple that's indicated, and that's missing. So if we come back here to this slide, if we have religion in here, we can say there's definitely a church, stained glass windows, might be more Unitarian or something because of the fact that we are missing the steeple and the cross. So that there's definitely an indication of religion, but we are not necessarily sure which one. And that may very well be purposeful, that he has designed it so that we are not indicating a particular denomination. We also see down here, if we look carefully, we also see down here a family that appears to be a same-sex couple that are slipped in here. Maybe, maybe not, but this is something that is actually fairly common with this writer and with this illustrator, is that they will just normalize different kinds of families within their books. And so we can actually say, all right, we've got representation of a same-sex couple right here. We can fill that in, family composition. In this case, we might indicate that we have a same-sex couple. We'll talk about another thing with family composition in a second. Okay. We also see that CJ is with his grandmother, his Nana. Okay. And that would be something else where we could go back and we could start filling in that part about family composition. We don't necessarily have a mom and a dad. We have a child and we have a grandmother. Different kind of family composition that's being represented. We can also start looking at the language. How come we got to wait for the bus and all this wet? Trees get thirsty too. Don't you see the big ones drinking through a straw? We can hear some of that AAVE language that is emerging. And we may be able to start making some indications that we have representation as CJ may very well be African-American as opposed to Latino. Okay. We also can get into the fact that they're walking, they're waiting for the bus. He's upset about having to wait for the bus. But we also see that Nana's got some earrings. She's got a necklace. She's well dressed. So if we come back to that socioeconomic slot, that may be in question. Maybe the reason they don't have a car and that they are riding the bus is because they're in an urban area and it's kind of pointless to have a car. So we can look at things like that and start being able to fill this in. And you may end up with something that looks like this, that the book is the last stop on Market Street. Our race is African-American, indicated by brown skin and language choices. The gender, CJ is a boy. We know this through the illustrations and pronouns. Sexuality, we have a same-sex family that's in that page. Family composition, grandmother, grandson. Not really sure socioeconomic levels. Christianity is there, and it's obviously an urban setting. And we can be able to use this particular graphic to start mapping out the books that we have. And we can even do it with something like this, which where you look at this and I know we all know this book. We all love this book, right? Goodnight Moon. And it's about an animal. And yet we can look at these animal books and see that they really do still have a particular bent in terms of its sociocultural stance. Because what we have here is we have the old woman who's saying hush is part of this book. We see that you have this entire room for this one little rabbit. Okay. The rabbit is white. We also see that there was a nanny, the old woman, probably a nanny, who is whispering hush. We also have the cow jumping over the moon, nursery rhymes that are all aligned with white upper to middle class cultures. So even something like Goodnight Moon that seems to be innocuous, still, if we analyze it using this particular perspective and approach, we can see that there is still a particular perpetuation of a particular ideology. And it is something for us. And I will tell you, when Melissa first told me this, I was like, oh my God, you just crushed me. Like, I am absolutely devastated about this because I love this book. But it really raised my awareness levels of being able to say, okay, I can see where this is. And it is something that we really have to look at. Okay. All right. There's our three approaches. Just kind of want you to consider for a minute, like what's kind of resonating with you. What are the things that you are like, okay, what am I going to take away from here? And what are you thinking about as I've gone through these couple of approaches?
I think that's a great spot to really ask people, to open up and with the time and everything else. And I know I want to have a few moments for questions at the end. If anybody would like to unmic and share like some questions, some overarching thoughts regarding this approach and using this in your classroom.
Or just what's percolating around in your brain right
now?
Dahlia's over here trying to talk. Sorry.
Sorry. That's okay. I love the idea of using picture books with older students because number one, they're short.
Mhm.
And they have such great application for texts that we're expecting them to read as freshmen and sophomores in high school. And if they can use what we model for them using a picture book, then hopefully we'll get them to start applying that to books that they may read on their own, and just getting them to think on that deeper level is so powerful. So I appreciate you sharing these wonderful examples.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share what's maybe percolating in their brain, or are you still storing through it?
Up until this year, I've worked with students with disabilities, with reading disabilities. So sometimes low non-readers by definition. So I use books with no texts to level the playing field. So they look at the pictures and then there's no embarrassment. So they don't have to read anything out loud and get called dumb or, whatever. People giggle at them when they miss a word. And then I used them as a writing assignment. So they had to write the book. So,
And then
they're not as, they're not as diverse as they should be from what I'm seeing. I haven't heard of a lot of these books. So many of the books I have were white protagonists or animals. So yeah, so that's what I'm thinking about.
excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And one of the nice things about picture books is that you have the pictures to support the text. So if you do have those striving readers, what's nice is they may not necessarily be able to read the words as well as they might want to, but because they've got the pictures to support it, it helps to build their vocabulary, that they are able to start working towards better reading. They're able to build their vocabulary, both disciplinary and definitely disciplinary literacy. Because like books, like I said, The Stuff of Stars, this one's astronomy and about the Big Bang Theory and everything else. So you're getting some of that language, but you've got the pictures to be able to help them with those context clues, which is excellent. Okay.
I love this, Jennifer. And I one of the ways that I love to use picture books when I was teaching 9th grade English was sort of as a way to introduce a larger theme for a unit, right? And so one of the things that now that I'm a teacher educator that I do is I teach critical literacy by having them do a critical literacy reading of the train book. I think I can. What is it called?
The little engine that could.
Thank you. But that is really fun because it enters into this whole like critique of the American dream, right? And like, let's introduce inequitable social structures and the idea that like not everybody's I think I can has the same opportunity to go in the same directions. And it's interesting because it's really emotional also for people, right? Because it's such a beloved book and it's so ingrained in sort of what it means to be American. And so I find that that's a really, like Kristen, you were saying, like you want to sort of lower the floor and have an entry point that everyone can get in. And then it's like everybody's in. And now we have to grapple with these huge things. Which I love doing.
And I love that, Brittany, because I did the same thing with my 11th graders. We had a unit on like morality, which was kind of the theme that brought everything together. And I always started it with the Cat in the Hat, because the very last page is, their mother comes in, she asks, what have you done? And their question is, well, should we tell her, would you do that? And it ends with this moral dilemma of, do you lie to your mom about what happened that day when the Cat in the Hat and thing 1 and thing 2 came and destroyed everything? Or do you just kind of pass it off? What would you do? And what moral compass do you have? And what drives that moral compass for you to make a decision one way or another? Definitely gets into some of those deep ideas of how we work and why we work in a certain way.
And I love in the chat that Dr. Rashid, you commented about having this content analysis piece. And that was kind of why I was like, yes, take that time in the moment to go to it so everybody has that link. There are a lot of different ones that are out there, but this was a really good one, that quick access and that you could just take away from this this webinar. So Jennifer, I appreciate you, taking that moment to do that, but I absolutely agree that it's a great takeaway.
Yeah, good, thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and just wrap anything up, and then if there's any additional questions, then we can go ahead and address those. I just wanted to end with a couple of thoughts. The first of which is that, picture books transform the human experience and they reflect it back on us as part of that larger human experience. As we know, good literature always does, and picture books are good literature, and we have to make sure that we recognize that. Why is it not moving forward? There we go. This was the slide that I told you about. I included, but I'm not going to go through this. If you are interested in some information to audit your school libraries or your classroom libraries, these are the points that you might want to consider and things that you might want to think about as you're going through and auditing. Again, it's here for you. I'm not going through it. And then I just had to throw this in here because we all know the pigeon driving the bus. And I thought that you guys would find this humorous because we all are living the nationwide shortages of everybody and everything, where we have National Guard coming in and driving buses. So I just thought it would be humorous for us to know that because of the nationwide shortage, the pigeon has been allowed to drive the bus. Yay, pigeon. So, and then if you would like to have information for further reading, we have a number of different articles and chapters that are, some of which are out, some of which are coming out. So I just wanted to give you that little bibliography in case you were interested in it. And this is our contact information. If you want more information about literacy in the disciplines, you have our email address as well as our website there. My information is here, and my fabulous facilitator, Rochelle's information is here as well. And with that, I am done. If you have any additional questions or would like to share anything that you're doing, that would be fantastic. We'd really appreciate your sharing it. And thank you so much for coming and spending your Thursday evening with us.
Yes,
Kristen,
thank you.
I know you. We've met before. Where have we met?
Mute. Circular.
Thank you. Like, you are out of context. I can't find you. Okay, there we go. Good. I'm so glad that
Yeah,
we
and you were low on my screen, and when you spoke, I was like, oh, I know who that is. I know who that
I've
is.
heard that. I was also not showing my background because I have, people in my house, and I didn't know what they were gonna do.
I'm locked in my husband's music room with the door closed, so we're all
Yeah.
downstairs doing piano. So
Okay, well, Jennifer, thank you so much. I absolutely loved this. I love picture books, and you were like bringing me back and making me think of all these things I could do. And Rochelle, you're giving me new ideas for books and the math books that I've never heard of. I'm going to look at those. So I'm excited.
Brittany, introduce yourself.
Me?
You
Oh,
missed that at the
sorry.
beginning.
Yeah, sorry, I came in late. I'm Brittany Kane. I'm a assistant professor of literacy at the Citadel, and I teach in the Masters of Literacy program. And I love doing it, and I get to work with Rochelle and Jennifer on a bunch of grants and things related to secondary literacy.
And I just wanted, Kristen, you pointed out New Kid, and it's a graphic novel, and I love graphic novels too. In fact, my colleagues and I we just wrote a proposal for NCTE that we're moving into Graphia now. So I love that you brought that one up.
Well, we will stay on if anybody wants to stay on for a few moments. Otherwise, it was wonderful to meet some of you, see some of you, and hope to see you next month. It'll always be is this the third Thursday? Whatever Thursday this is of every month. And the next one will be with Brittany, Dr. Kane, and I think one of our other board members, Charlene Aldrich. So, and it'll be focusing on some of the background on content area and disciplinary literacy. What does this mean? How does this look different? Why do we need to know it? It's a great presentation. highly recommend letting people know and coming for that one in March.
I forwarded this to my reading intervention coordinator for the district. So,
Awesome. Thank you.
I mean, like while I was in it, so it was late, but maybe next time.
We're still hoping to be able to get it up on the website so that people are going to be able to still access it. So here's
Okay.
hoping.
Sounds good.